Hello friends, welcome to KK Codes. Friends, in this video we are going to solve one more coding question, which is to find pick elements in an given array. So in this question you will given an array of size n and there can be multiple pick elements and you need to print all the pick elements of this particular array. Okay, so we are going to see what the pick element is all about, but the basic question is print all pick elements, print all pick elements. Okay, so let's move to our the next part, which is what is a pick element. So what exactly a pick element is? If you google it, you will most probably will find two definitions of different websites. I have collected from InterviewBeat, Geeks for Geeks, and LeetCode. So according to InterviewBeat and Geeks for Geeks, a pick element is an element which should not be smaller than its neighbors. So what exactly a neighbor is? So let's say we have a array of size 3, and in this array there will be some elements, let's say 4, 5, 2. In this case, this 3 has only one neighbor, which is 4, and this 4 has two neighbors, as it is 3 and 2, and this 2 has again only one neighbor, which is 4. So the basic conclusion is that if it is the rightmost, leftmost and the rightmost elements have only one neighbor, the adjacent elements are termed as a neighbors, and if it is the middle element, it can have multiple middle elements. Let's say in this example there are three middle elements, so the middle elements will have two neighbors and the leftmost and rightmost element will have only one neighbor, right? So according to InterviewBeat and Geeks for Geeks, if a element is not smaller than its neighbor, then it will be termed as a pick element. So in this case 3 is smaller than 4, right? So the condition doesn't satisfy. So in this case 3 is not a pick element. Now let's move on to our next element, which is 4. So 4 has two neighbors, which is 3 and 2, and when 4 is not smaller than 3 and 2, yes it does, so this 4 will be considered as a pick element. Now move to next, which is 2. So 2 has only one neighbor, which is 4, right? So in this case 2 is smaller, but it should not be smaller. So again the condition doesn't satisfy, and this is also not a pick element. So in this array of size 3 we have only one pick element, which is 4. So our task is to print all the pick elements in a given array, right? Now what's the difference between this LeetCode definition? According to this LeetCode definition, the pick element should be greater than its neighbors. Here we have discussed not smaller, but here we have this definition says it should be greater than. Let's take an example of 3 and 3. Two elements are there. In this case 3 is not smaller than 3, but it is equal, right? So it is condition not smaller. It can be equal. It can be equal, but it should not be smaller. So in this case this 3 will be considered as a pick element, and this 3 will also be considered as a pick element because it has only one neighbor. This is the neighbor of this one and this is the neighbor of this one, right? So these both 3 will be considered as a pick element in the definition of Geeks for Geeks and InterviewBeat, but in the LeetCode definition it should be greater than. So this 3 is not greater than this 3, right? So according to this definition, it is not a peak element. So we will go with the Geeks for Geeks definition and we will find a solution based on this definition. Okay. Alright. Now let's take some more example to understand how we are going to solve this. So let's say if we have given only one element in a given array, so ultimately it doesn't have any neighbors, right? So ultimately it will be termed as a pick element, and our task will be to print this element as a pick element. Now let's consider the elements, two elements in an array. So in this case this 10 has only one neighbor, this 10, and this 10 has only one neighbor, this 10, right? So yes, it is not smaller than. So element should not be less than. Element should not be less than, but it can be equal. So should not be less than, but it can be equal. So in this case, both the 10 should be printed as a pick element. So now the third example, in this case, leftmost element is 4, which has a neighbor of 5. So 4 is a smaller, so this condition doesn't satisfy. 4 is not a pick element. Now this 5. This 5 has two neighbors, 4 and 3. And both of them are smaller than this 5, right? So this 5 will be considered as a pick element. Now this 3. 3 should not be smaller than the neighbor, but it is, so it is not, will be considered as a pick element. So only 5 will be considered as a pick element. In this case, both these 10 will be considered as a pick element, and in this 5 is also a pick element because it doesn't have any neighbors. So in the same way, this 5 will be considered as a pick element because it is greater than or equal to this 4, right? It has only one neighbor. Now this 4 has two neighbors, 5 and 6. So it is not smaller than, it should not smaller than 6 and 5, but this is not the case, so this is not a pick element. Now let's consider this 6th element, which is at index 2. So this is not smaller than 5, not 3. So this will be considered as a pick element. And now let's take of example of this 3. This 3 has only one neighbor, which is 6. So 6 is not smaller than this 3, right? So this should not be smaller than its neighbor. So this is again not a pick element. So in the same way, this 4 and this 7 will be considered as a pick element according to our definition. So I hope the question is clear to you. Now let's move on to the algorithm part. The first thing which we are going to check for is that the array size should be have some elements, right? So the array should not be empty. Only then we can find some pick elements. So this is the condition if array size is greater than 0. Now if it is greater than 0, the next condition is if the array size is equals to 1, which means it has only one element. So if the array is only one element, then ultimately it is going to be the pick element. So we need to print ARR 0. This is a pick element. Whatever the value, it doesn't matter. It is going to be considered as a pick element. Now, if the size is greater than, move on to the next part, which is else part. In this else part, we are going to declare a variable called I, and I will be initialized with 0. Why 0? Because array elements are start from index 0 onwards, right? So I value will be 0 and it will go to the 0 to n. Let's say we have an example of array size 5. So it will go from 0 to 5. So the first element will have only one neighbor. So this condition is basically for the first leftmost element. Now how does this check for the leftmost element? Because we have tested here I is equals to 0, which basically means we are currently working on the first element of the array. So if this is the case, then what next we need to check? We need to check if it is not smaller than the neighbor. The neighbor is here. Let's say we have 4 here, we have 3 here. So if this 4 is not smaller than this 3, which basically means this 4 will be considered as a pick element. So we are doing the same here. If I is equals to 0 and I of ARR of I, which basically means this index, is greater than or equal to ARR I plus 1, which means this one, then we need to print the ARR value. So in this case 4 will be printed here. Now this condition is for testing the last rightmost element. In the rightmost element, we again need to consider only one neighbor, which is this previous one, right? So in this case, we are testing here if I is equals to size minus 1. Size is basically can be, let's say in this example 5. So the last index will be 5 minus 1 is equals to 4. So it means we are, if I value has index of accessing the last element, then ARRI basically means this one 8, let's say, is greater than or equal to the next previous element. So if this is the case, then again print this ARRI. Now we have considered the leftmost element and the rightmost element. Now the middle elements. To access the middle elements, this condition is going to satisfy. If ARR of I, let's say we are here in the index of 1. So in this case, what we need to check is that the previous elements at index 0 and index 2 need to be verified that this index value should not be less than, it should be greater than or equal to its neighbors, right? So here we have tested if ARR of I is greater than or equal to ARR I minus 1, which basically means this element, and ARRI is greater than equals to its right neighbor. If this is the case, then this is also a pick element. And now at last we will do I plus plus, so that each element will be accessed one by one. After that, accessing all the elements, it is going to print all the pick elements. And now let's talk about time complexity of this program. So of course we are going to access all the elements one by one and compare it with its neighbors. So it is going to be order of n. So if the array size is n, it is going to access all the elements one by one. So the time complexity will be order of n. And if I talk about space complexity, then it will be order of n, because we are not using any other array, we are just using two variables called I and size. So the space complexity will be order of 1. So I already have written the program of this, and now let's see here. We have a main function. The main function has an array of size, this 5, 10, 20, 15. In this case, this 20 will be considered as a pick element, because this is the only element which value has greater than or equal to its neighbor. So in this case 20 has two neighbors, 10 and 15. So 20 is greater than or equal to 15 or 10, right? So in this case only 20 should be printed. So I have pick elements a method in this array is given and the size of the array is given. And here we have tested if the size is greater than 0, which basically means array has some elements. And now if size is equals to 1, only one size, only one element in the given array, then print that value, because ultimately it is going to be considered as a pick element. In the else, we have tested this while loop, which basically means it can have more than one elements. It can have 2 element, 3 element or 5 elements, whatever it is. We are going to test all the elements one by one, and based on these conditions it is going to print that value. So let's compile and run this program and see the output. Yes, this shows 20 only, because 20 is the pick element in this given array. I hope you understand the problem. Thank you for watching this video.